Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was March 6th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. So we're supposed to be doing a document per day for Joan and Violante. And today we're gonna kind of bend that rule a bit. We've got a bunch of documents, and one of them actually takes us back in time to late February. So just about a week or 10 days or so prior to March 6th. And the reason for that is I was learning a little bit more about how to navigate the system of dating and ordering in these registers. And I was working for a long time on the document that we're going to start with today, which is actually dated on the 27th of February. And the reason I got confused, you'll see if you look at the image for folio 17V, because it looks like there's a little letter at the top that finishes, and then the probata for that letter of about, I think it's 8 lines, is off to the right hand side of the folio. And then it's not too uncommon for the next thing unrelated to that probata to start on pretty much like the same level on the page, like horizontally right next to it, like what we see here. So we've got this interesting new shape. There's a lot of squiggly lines that the scribes like to use. Here we have what looks like a big C, and then a line down, and then a horizontal line with some little squigglies in the middle. And these had different meanings, and I haven't yet found a source that explains all of them. So I think when we have a dividing line like this, it has some kind of meaning attached to it that the scribes would have known, but maybe has been lost to time. And so it's not uncommon in this situation, looking at this document, to say, and rightfully so, that what appears on the second 2/3 of the page is something unrelated to what appears at the top. It turns out that I was wrong in thinking that in this situation, but what it led me to do is to keep flipping forward to try to find a date. And so looking at the next folio, which is 18R, there's no date. And so I turned again and then got to a series of letters that are dated March 6th. Okay, another thing that led me to conflate what I saw on folio 18V, which is 3 letters all dated March 6th, with the 2 folios that came before. Back on February 28th, we talked about letters that Violante had written to the Pope authorizing Luchino Scarampi, the Genoese financier, to talk to the Pope about marriage negotiations for Joan and Violante's daughter, Yolanda of Aragon. And here we have 3 letters that follow the same pattern of salutation as those 3 letters from February 28th. My Latin group is still working on those February 28th letters, so I have them top of mind. So when I saw this on folio 18V in Joan's register, I immediately recognized, okay, we've got the Serenissime et Beatissime Pater for the Pope, and then we've got 2 letters each with Reverende Padres et Amice Carissime for some other groups of clerics. It also turns out that we have specified clerics listed for the 2nd and 3rd letter in this 3-letter set on Joan's register, and that might help us to figure out who the intended recipients were for the letters in Violante's register that followed the same group of 3 pattern. So, okay, that's a lot to say that it made me connect the stuff that had come before, which is about Scarampi and about the marriage, to the date of March 6th. But now that I've been looking at this for a while, I'm thinking that the information that's on the second 2/3 of the second part, the second and third, oh gosh, what am I trying to say here? The bottom 60% of folio 17V, I think that information is actually connected to the February 27th letter, but I can't be completely sure about that. It's just what I'm guessing now. And likewise for the end of that information on folio 18R. Okay, so before we go further along, because there's actually 8 folios that I want to talk about today, I just want to cover what's going on in folio 17V and folio 18R. Folio 17V begins with an authorization for Luchino Scarampi to carry out negotiations for the marriage of Joan and Violante's daughter. To who? To Louis of Anjou. And I actually got really confused because on the first line of the it's the chunk that's right below where it says the capitula credentiae supradicte, so that heading in the middle separates out what's coming below from the letter above, and then the first chunk reads, and this is in Catalan, sobre fet del matrimoni tractador del rey Lois de Sicilia and then some other stuff. Okay, so this whole LOYS got me really confused because I thought it was like a region because I hadn't quite settled on Sicilia as the transcription there for what came after the day. And so I got really just off into some weird thinking about this. But then what I did is I went to the Diccionario, let's see, what is it? The Catalan Valence Balearic. And that's like the Oxford English Dictionary, but for like Catalan and Valencian. And so I put in LOYS, and it came back as Luis. So that's Louis. So that's the person that, indeed, Joan and Violante's daughter, who's known as Yolanda of Aragon, that's who she ended up marrying. And so what we are looking at are little articles that specify some of the terms of the marriage negotiation for the daughter of Joan and Violante to Louis of Anjou, who at this time was known as King Louis of Sicily, for reasons that are so complicated. Because I know I've already talked about how Sicily was like a territory of the Crown of Aragon, but alas, we don't have time to dig into that in all that much detail right now. I'll link to an episode prior where I talked about Sicily a little bit more. The thing I want to point out about some of these marriage terms, and there's a couple different things being addressed here, but the dowry amount is listed, and it's listed, get this, it's listed as 100,000 florins. Oh my gosh, that is so much money. And when I saw that it was 100,000 florins as the dowry, I had something click in my mind about why it is that Luchino Scarampi is in charge. Because I think he's going to be the one that facilitates the transfer of that gigantic sum. Cannot be in coins. It's just too much to be able to gather all of that physical coinage. So this is definitely a money of account. There were certain times where coins were required, such as when paying a ransom, like if you were talking about some kind of act of piracy, then there might be a requirement to make the payment in coin, but this is almost certainly going to be carried out as a payment of account, meaning that it's just going to be a transfer on paper. And for that amount of money, you're going to have some sophisticated financial infrastructure. And I think that Luchino Scarampi is the one that can provide that for this transaction. One other thing to point out about this set of terms for the marriage negotiation that is entrusted to Scarampi, at the end of it on folio 18R, notice the probata. It's super interesting because it's actually both Bartolomeo Sirvent, who is Violante's scribe, and actually Bartolomeo Sirvent did the letter on the previous folio too. And then here, though, it's Bartolomeo Sirvent being commanded this by the king. And then below that, in line 3 of the probata, we also have the queen, Domina Regina. So they're co-writing this through the scribe Bartolomeo Sirvent. This is not just Joan. And that's really important because you might think initially, because it's in his register, that this should be attributed to Joan. It's not. This document is written by both of them together, and there's no way to deny that level of cooperation based on this probata. And also the fact that Violante's scribe is taking the lead. That's interesting. All right, now we're on folio 18V, turning the page. And here we've got the 3 letters that I mentioned before. Already kind of talked about these, that we've got the same pattern as what Violante had in her 3 letters that she sent along with Luchino Scarampi. But why are these letters that Joan has written, and it's Joan's scribe here, his name is Père de Benjure, why is it that these letters are several days later on March 6th? they match the pattern of Violante's letters from February 28th. That is a mystery to me. The clues about the destination of the second and third letter are that the second letter has an addressee line, Fuit Missa Collegio Cardinalium, so the College of Cardinals. And then the third letter has an addressee line, Fuit Missa Cardinal, maybe this could be singular, Cardinal Embrudenem or Denen. It's hard to read because the scribe actually crossed out another cardinal's name there. Although it seems like, well, is this a single cardinal or is it? I guess it's single. Yeah, because you can see that it's in the nouns are in singular endings in the beginning. So that's interesting. Okay, so now turning the page, we have a new capitula at the top. This is also going to be dated March 6th. You have to flip forward a couple pages in order to get to where you would find the date, all the way to folio 21R. So I think that's where we see that this is still March 6th. And we don't have a date until we get there. And what begins on folio 19R and ends on folio 21R is this long list of items. Oh, gosh. I said items because the word item is used at the beginning of each paragraph, and it's just so tempting to say it's an item. But item actually means likewise. So these different, do we call them requests? Do we call them demands? Do we call them points? I'm not quite sure because I don't know how much Joan's clout is in relation to the Avignon Pope. The ambassadors have been appointed, and these points are ones that were given to them to take to the Pope. How do I know that? The top of the folio has this capitula Credentiae Ambassadoribus Andictis. That means that this is the section of credentials for the ambassadors that have been appointed. So, Joan has appointed ambassadors to go to Avignon and to present these requests, or I don't know if they're requests or if they're more like expected, like whether Joan is expecting them to be fulfilled. So that is a question that maybe I can get at if I do a little bit more research about how much leverage Joan had. It's really interesting that Luchino Scarampi is going to take care of the wedding negotiation, and that negotiation is taking place in Avignon. And then Joan has appointed some other ambassadors, specifically a knight named Père d'Artes, and also the Archbishop of Saragossa, whose name is Garcia, and then another person who I think is a chamberlain named Raymond de Francia. And the three of them are going to go to Avignon and present these articles to, I like that, the word article, these articles to the Pope. And what's in these articles? It's a real grab bag of stuff. Some of it is like, I'd like that this particular monastery or abbey gets elevated to be a bishopric. And then other things are specific to the status of office holders and you can't double up on the ecclesiastical office holders. There's certain objections that Joan is raising to foreigners, quote unquote foreigners, who are being appointed to ecclesiastical positions inside the Crown of Aragon, and he does not like that and wants that to stop. And then there's this really interesting moment that is on folio 19V, and it's in the first article there. Line 7 has this phrase, Bartolomeo Antipape, the anti-pope. So Clement VII of Avignon has gone down in history as the anti-pope. But from the perspective of his supporters, with Joan being one of his most fervent supporters, the other pope, the one in Rome, is the one who's rightfully referred to as the anti-pope. So Joan here is addressing an issue that came up as a result of dealings with in his mind, the wrong pope, the one in Rome. That one is the anti-pope. So what's being discussed here? Well, the line above, line 6, is about his father. And in the middle of the line, we have the word indifferencia, which is, I think, a Catalan word that's been put in to this Latin paragraph. The indifferencia domini sui genitoris. So he's talking about his father's indifference. Per refused to take a side in the Great Western Schism, and consequences of that neutrality came down, I think, in terms of certain restrictions or certain losses that now that Joan is throwing his full support behind Avignon Pope Clement VII, Joan wants these things to be restored. And there's certain possessions, I think, that are being referred to here. I'm looking at a couple words after anti-pape on line 7, and I'm seeing that there's this possessorem. And so I think there's certain rights or even revenues that were restricted from the Crown of Aragon because Per refused to support wholeheartedly the Avignon Pope. All right. One other thing I want to point out in these articles, which are, can get very in the weeds. I feel like, if someone was doing a dissertation on the Great Western Schism and the Crown of Aragon, the documents that I'm looking at today, the 8 folios in this register, they could be a whole dissertation chapter because of how much is packed in here and how weedsy it can get. I did just want to point out something, though, which is on folio 20R, and it's in the article that is the 3rd. So there's a long chunky one, and then the 3rd article has in its second to last line a mention of Innocent and Urban. So these are popes from long ago, and I just wanted to point out that, and it's not even all that important what's being discussed here in the article, but the larger point is that when the kings of this time were trying to justify what they wanted from the Pope, they could reach back in history to, decades and sometimes centuries earlier, to this knowledge of what had been done in earlier times and the precedents and the patterns that had been set in place way long ago. And I think that this can even apply to something that appears at the very end of this list of articles, where the name Gregory is mentioned. It's in the last line of folio 20V. And I think possibly this is a nod to how there's been this long tradition that Joan is saying he's aware of and that everything he's requesting is in line with. I think potentially this is some other Gregory, but yeah, my Latin and understanding of these documents is not good enough to really know for sure. But just the fact that Gregory, that name is mentioned, and that's got such an amazing cachet from, the legacy of Gregory the Great. I think what we're seeing here is a display of in-depth knowledge of ecclesiastical history and a very sophisticated argument for all of these articles that are being justified. We're not even done, because on the 8th folio that we're looking at today, we have yet another document from Joan. This one on folio 21R, also dated March 6th. And then tomorrow, we're going to look at the bottom half of this folio, where there's one from March 7th. But I just wanted to say that, all of those prior letters to the clerics that we were looking at before all of the articles for the ambassadors, that was not enough. There was some other person, and it seems like this letter was actually copied. There was some other person that needed to be addressed. And I think what we're looking at the bottom of this letter is a addressee clause that's very similar to what we were looking at on February 28th with the letters from Violante that had no addressee. Because if you look at that addressee line at the bottom, we see similis fuiter, and then two words I cannot quite make out, but then the last two words of that line are sine supra, then the last line scriptione, and then 23. Does that mean that they made 23 copies of this? That can't be. That can't. Well, maybe that is what that means. Goodness, that would be something if they made 23 copies of that letter to give to sort of random ecclesiastical officials, but I'm not sure. Oh gosh, and then there's one other thing that I want to point out, because I'm starting to learn about the little notes that come after the year in the dating clause, so stuff that comes at the very end. Sometimes it's easy, it just says La Reina or Rex Johannes, and you know exactly what that means. But here we have Franciscus Sacosta. That is the vice chancellor for Joan. And that is a different person than the scribe, because very clearly we have a probata, Dominus Rex, mandavit mihi per de beniore. So, what is the vice chancellor's name doing at the end of this letter? That is a question that I don't quite know how to answer right now, but I feel like I'm on the verge of being able to figure that out. Did the vice chancellor sign this letter and it's thrown into Joan's register? Not sure at this time. Oh my gosh, I've broken 30 minutes. No. Oh, I had a goal to keep all the episodes under 30 minutes because the actual intent is to have 15-minute episodes. And here I am. But it was 8 folios, folks. My gosh. How am I going to talk about 8 folios in less than 30 minutes? Just can't do it. Well, thanks for bearing with me on another long episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, and if you would like to write a long journal article or master's thesis about the Crown of Aragon during the Great Schism and want to use these documents, well, you probably need a lot more information, and having all of those questions means I have done my job, because remember, the motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.